They confessed their sins, but no one ever heard their final words. Hidden behind the doors of an ancient parish, a secret waited for decades. Priests whispered of it only in shadows, and the church denied its very existence. What we found inside the confessional was neither divine nor human, and the truth is still alive. In the echoes of prayers that never ended, the air was still, almost unnervingly so. Fog clung to the edges of the town, curling around the lampposts, around the gutters, around the jagged outline of the church. The building itself seemed reluctant to be seen. Its dark spire, a thin finger pointing accusingly at the gray sky. The camera, or rather the mind's eye, lingered on the stonework, mottled with moss and age, the walls heavy with decades of disuse. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but the locals knew better. They avoided its shadowed doors, crossing the street, taking long detours through the overgrown graveyard. Few would speak of it, and when they did, voices lowered to whispers, as if the words themselves carried a contagion. The investigators arrived on a damp morning, their shoes pressed into the mud of the churchyard, leaving temporary imprints in soil thick with dead leaves. Each step echoed against the quiet town, but not in the open streets. No, it was the sound of their own intrusion that seemed to awaken something patient. The parish had been built in the 1800s. Its foundations had felt centuries of weather and neglect. The brick was pitted, cracked, stained with dark streaks where water had run unchecked. Stained glass windows, once vivid with saints and angels, were now pale, muted shadows of color. To paint on the wooden doors flaked like dried skin, and the bell tower loomed, skeletal, silent. They paused at the threshold. The smell hit them first. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something metallic beneath. A faint hint of rust or dried blood that lingered just long enough to make the stomach tighten. A young woman, one of the investigators, ran a hand along the carved wood of the confessional door. She flinched. "It feels wrong," she said. The others exchanged looks, but none could articulate why. Not fully, not yet. Inside, the church was colder than the morning air. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and reluctant. Dust motes drifted lazily in shafts of pale sunlight. The pews were crooked, some collapsed under decades of neglect. Candles sat half-burnt in rusted holders, blackened stubs like teeth broken off too soon. But something wasn't right. The confessional booths were the first place they examined. Heavy wood, worn smooth in places, splintered in others. Small windows for privacy, their screens yellowed and brittle. It was immediately clear that the booths had been used more recently than the town records suggested, but by whom, and for what, no one could say. The investigators stepped inside one at a time, moving slowly, deliberately. Their microphones caught every creak, every shift of air. They spoke in whispers, careful not to break the oppressive silence. "Did anyone hear that?" one of them asked. The response was only the faintest rustle, a shifting of air, or perhaps the sound of something else entirely. And that's when he heard it. The soft, almost imperceptible sigh, coming from the confessional, a breath, or a whisper, he couldn't tell which. His heartbeat accelerated, thumping in his ears louder than the sound itself. The others froze. The booths had secrets, centuries of them, confessions spoken into the darkness, sins carried in shadows, whispered prayers that never left the wood. They were sealed, but not entirely. One of the investigators, a man in his 40s, traced his fingers along the edges of a door, feeling the carved panels beneath his fingertips. The wood seemed warmer here, alive, almost. His rational mind dismissed it, blamed it on old heating pipes or damp air, yet the sensation lingered. Outside, the town moved on. Children laughed on the streets beyond, oblivious. Dogs barked, engines rumbled, church bells far off rang. Normal life. But inside, time had stopped. The air was thicker, heavier, Memory clung to the walls, the floors, the pews. Memory that remembered sins long forgiven or condemned. They explored systematically. Each step revealed another layer of decay, another hint of something not yet unearthed. Pages from hymnals, brittle and yellowed, were scattered across the floor. Some bore annotations in spidery ink, others splattered with darker stains. A crucifix hung crookedly behind the altar. Its figure of Christ was chipped, worn expression eroded into something almost human, almost pleading. The investigators could not stop staring. It felt as if the eyes followed them, silently judging, silently remembering. And then the floorboards shifted beneath one of them, a subtle but unmistakable give. Dust plumes rose, catching the light. Their hearts jumped, but the confessional doors drew them back, always, as if the building itself insisted they see. The scent intensified: earth, mold, rust, and something else, something metallic and sweet. Their stomachs churned, a low nausea that seemed to seep from the very walls. One investigator knelt at a booth, peering through the worn screen. Inside, darkness seemed to thicken, as though it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. A faint scratch echoed, wood on wood, nails, or something else entirely. And that's when the first real unease set in. They began to whisper among themselves, names, dates, confessions that had never been heard aloud, whispers of vanished priests, monks who had never left, parishioners who entered seeking absolution and were never seen again. The stories were half remembered, fractured, and yet they felt credible here. In this place, the air seemed to agree. A breeze swept through the church, though no windows were open. Dust swirled, candle stubs wavered, shadows flickered in corners where no light should reach. Their rational minds struggled against the instinct rising in their chest, that they were not alone. The lead investigator stepped back. We should document this, every detail, every anomaly. But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of centuries pressing down. Something patient, something that had waited for them, and not just them. The history of the place, the secrets embedded in wood and stone, sealed behind the confessional doors, centuries of sins and confessions too dark to leave the booth. The team moved slowly, documenting, photographing, noting, but each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the church was growing denser, thicker, compressing the air around them. The sense of observation shifted subtly, from omniscient awareness to a survivor's edge of terror. They could hear it now, faint at first, a scraping, like fingernails across wood, somewhere deep behind the confessional, too soft to locate, but insistent. They paused, held their breath. The sound stopped, but the instinct remained. They were not alone. One investigator touched a panel, cold, then warmer, then pulsing with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. And then the whispers began, not in words, not yet, just the sense of voices pressing against the edges of perception, echoes of sins, regrets, confessions never absolved. They could not see the source, could not predict it, could not even tell if it was real, but they were listening. And that's when it hit, the realization that the church had not forgotten them. They had entered, yes, but the confessional doors had been waiting, patient, judgmental, alive in ways that the mind could only begin to grasp. And as they stood there, a shift occurred, a subtle, almost imperceptible realignment of air and gravity. The shadows deepened, the dust thickened, the smell intensified, mold, rust, earth, and something else, something acidic, metallic, alive. They did not leave immediately, could not. Something rooted them to the spot, curiosity, fear, fascination, an inseparable knot. But the parish had begun its work, and the investigators, though unaware, had already crossed the threshold of centuries-old secrets that would not let go. One by one, they turned toward the confessional doors, drawn as if by an invisible hand, eyes wide, hearts thudding. The first door creaked, and inside, centuries of silent confessions waited. Time had forgotten this parish, but the parish had not forgotten them. The air felt heavier, thicker, and the weight of it pressed down, not just on their bodies, but on their minds. One investigator swore he heard a low voice, beneath the sighs of the wind,
and the distant hum of the town. "Welcome back." And in that instant, everything changed. The shadows of the church did not flicker. They deepened, they leaned, they waited, and the investigators realized, slowly, that they had walked into something far older than themselves, far darker than the whispers of the town could contain. The confessional doors remained closed, but the secrets inside had begun to stir, and that was when the first of them shivered. The evening settled over the town, like a heavy, damp blanket. Shadows stretched long across the graveyard, curling over the tops of forgotten stones, and through the skeletal branches of leafless trees. The church, still looming at the edge of town, seemed darker now, its silhouette carved sharply against the twilight, its windows gleaming faintly, as if holding secrets of their own. Inside, the air had cooled, thickened, the dust hung in still, wavering clouds, catching the last light of day. The investigators moved quietly, their footsteps careful, deliberate, on the uneven flagstone floors. The pews cast elongated shadows, black stripes across the walls, each one seeming to shift slightly when not observed directly. And yet, the church was empty, or so it appeared. Soft chants began to rise, faint, indistinct, barely audible, above the creak of floorboards, or the occasional gust of wind that rattled the broken windows. The voices had no origin, no one could locate them, but they threaded through the nave, curling around pillars, brushing along the walls like cold fingertips. The investigators froze, their eyes darted to corners, to doorways, to the shadowed arches. One of them whispered, "It's coming from everywhere," but something wasn't right. They approached the confessional. It sat as it had all day, heavy, dark wood, its screens yellowed with age. The doors closed but clearly used. The scent around it had shifted, an almost imperceptible tang beneath the must of old wood and damp stone, iron salt, something almost sweet. Scratches marred the interior of the booths, faint, shallow at first glance, as if from nails or keys, but the patterns were irregular, chaotic. Scraps of paper, folded and hidden between the panels, carried small, hurried notes, words half-written, smudged by time or trembling hands. Some were prayers, some were confessions, some were lines that made no sense. The team leaned closer, their lights picked out the faint lines of text. Each word seemed to pulse in the dim glow, vibrating with a
weight that was hard to quantify. And that's when he heard it, a soft scratching, coming from the back of the booth. The man's hand froze midair, his breath hitched, every instinct screamed to move, to run, but he didn't. He could not. The investigators rotated slowly, careful not to disturb whatever might be hiding in the shadows. Every sound, the whisper of air, the creak of wood, the faintest scratch, was amplified in the silence. Notes were retrieved, folded scraps that smelled of mildew and ink, some written in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. One read, simply, "He listens, always." The shadows seemed to deepen as the notes were spread out. Light bent strangely across the wood, across the panels, across the tiny slivers of space between the booth walls. A faint breath brushed against one investigator's neck. He jerked, but the others saw nothing. "Did you feel that?" he asked, voice low, trembling. No one answered. The chants grew, soft, circular, echoing through corridors that seemed to stretch further than architecture should allow. They were careful not to panic, but the rhythm of the sound pressed against their minds, a quiet insistence that gnawed at their concentration. A closer examination revealed deeper scratches, symbols, letters, perhaps a language no one alive remembered. The wood seemed to respond, almost imperceptibly, to touch, warmer here, colder there, pulsing under fingertips, like a faint heartbeat. The lead investigator traced one of the deeper grooves, faint traces of what might have been blood or rust, adhered stubbornly to the aged surface. He recoiled slightly, the rational mind screaming for calm. This shouldn't exist, he muttered. The team moved methodically, documenting photographs, notes, video. Each artifact seemed to insist upon attention. The confessional had always been a boundary, a barrier between the human and the unknowable. Now, that boundary felt thin, fraying. A subtle vibration ran through the floor. The chanting grew louder. The air thickened. Their own hearts seemed to echo the rhythm, pulsing in time with the sounds that had no source. And then they found it, a hidden hinge at the back of one booth, tiny, easily overlooked. A panel, misaligned. When opened, it revealed small, cramped space, hollow, empty, except for faint stains along the wood, dark and sticky, smeared in patterns that suggested hands, fingers, desperate, grasping. The realization hit slowly. The confessional had been used differently than anyone had known. Not just for sins, not just for prayers. Something else. Something patient. Waiting. Observing. The whispers intensified. Each investigator began to hear different voices, faint echoes, fragments of confessions, words that could not possibly have belonged to anyone in the room. One investigator swore he saw movement beneath the panels. Not light, not shadow, something that shifted just beyond perception, retreating when looked at directly. They tried to remain rational. They examined notes, photographs, every scratch, but their minds began to fray. The patterns suggested intent, something human, perhaps, or something else entirely. The distinction blurred. The building itself seemed to lean closer, ceilings lower, corners sharper, shadows deeper. The air grew thick with the smell of iron and damp decay, and that's when the first real fear set in. One of them, kneeling, touched the interior paneling again. The wood pulsed faintly, warm beneath the fingers. A low murmur brushed the edges of perception. Words, unintelligible, but deliberate, insistent. The confessional had secrets, centuries-old secrets, waiting, patient, hidden notes, scratches, faint traces of something else, something that had listened to every confession ever spoken within those walls. The investigators felt it now, a subtle oppression, pressing against their minds, not tangible, but undeniable. Their thoughts became fragmented. Each began to doubt their senses, their memories, their very presence in the room. The whispers pressed closer, almost comprehensible now. A fragmented phrase, a warning, a welcome, and the shadows responded, stretching toward them, leaning in. Noises in corners, soft creaks, footsteps, or something moving that had no feet. They could not leave yet. Curiosity, stubbornness, fascination, an invisible tether held them. The chants shifted, rising in pitch. The voices that had been soft became insistent, circular, repetitive, resonating deep within their chests, within their skulls. One of the investigators finally spoke, voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." But the confessional was not finished. It had begun to demand attention, to exact observation, to pull at the edges of reason. The team huddled together, notes clutched, cameras rolling. But the sense of the room had changed. They were no longer just observers. They were participants, and the scratches on the wood seemed to writhe, subtly, as if alive. The notes, the hidden panels, the faint traces of past intrusions, they were only the beginning. The whispers pressed closer. The walls seemed to breathe. The air hung heavy, laden with expectation and fear. And in that moment, the investigators understood. They had glimpsed the threshold of something beyond understanding, something patient, something that had waited, and the confessional was listening. The sanctuary breathed in shadows. Candlelight flickered against the vaulted ceilings, each flame bending in ways that seemed almost deliberate.
casting long fractured shapes along the stone walls. Dust floated in the warm orange haze, moving in slow, deliberate currents, as if guided by an unseen hand. The investigators stepped lightly onto the cold flagstone floor. Every footfall echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the vast emptiness of the space. The pews, worn and crooked, lined the nave like silent sentinels. Between them, the air carried the faint scent of melted wax, incense long spent, and something metallic beneath, a tang that pricked the nose and lingered at the back of the throat. And yet, the sanctuary seemed alive. The shadows shifted even without wind. Candles bent strangely, flames stretching toward dark corners. One investigator paused, noticing the stone behind the altar. The shadows there were longer than they should be, distorted, almost humanoid. But something wasn't right. Figures flickered in the corner of the eye. Nothing solid, nothing that could be grasped. One moment, a vague shape, a human outline perhaps, standing at the edge of the pews. The next gone, leaving only the space it had occupied, warped by shadows. The investigators whispered, careful, cautious. Their voices bounced off the stone arches, yet did not disturb the unsettling rhythm of the sanctuary. Soft murmurs reached them, almost imperceptible, not from within their team, not from any living person. Confessions spoken into the darkness, voices low, carrying sins and pleas, not meant for their ears. And that's when he heard it, a whisper, clearer than the rest. Forgive me. He froze, heart stuttering. The words were intimate, private, yet directed at no one, at him, or at all of them. He could not be sure. The lead investigator shone a flashlight along the walls. The beam trembled, shadows danced ahead of it, twisting into figures that should not exist, moving against the logic of light and space. The floor beneath seemed to slope subtly, unnaturally, pulling the eye toward the altar. They moved closer. Each step revealed more anomalies. Candle wax pulled in shapes that suggested figures kneeling. Faint scratches on the stone hinted at hurried movement, perhaps desperation, perhaps prayer. One investigator traced a hand along the carved altar rails. The wood was smooth, but warmer than expected, pulsing faintly under her fingertips. She pulled back sharply. It's like it's aware, she whispered. The voices grew, layering, overlapping, confessions from centuries past, or so they seemed, mixing with the present. Guilt, fear, remorse, words that clawed at faith, that pressed against reason. And then the figures appeared more clearly, not solid, but tangible, shadows that mimicked the posture of kneeling, standing, confessing. They moved without sound, sliding across the stone like smoke caught in a beam of light. The investigators' cameras captured nothing fully, only flickers, blurs, but they felt the presence, heavy, unyielding, pressing against the chest, the spine, the very center of thought. One of them knelt beside the altar, noting a faint indentation in the stone, the shape of a hand perhaps, pressed into centuries of dust. Another brushed a finger across it, cold, yet still there, persistent. The air grew heavier. Each breath seemed to resist inhalation. Shadows gathered, congregated in corners, along arches, in places where light should have gone. The sanctuary itself seemed to constrict, bending time, space and reason. And that's when he heard it again, a single voice, unmistakable. Confess, not a suggestion, not a plea, a demand. The investigators exchanged glances. Rationality clung to them like a thin veil, but the instinct was stronger. Fear, the kind that seeps in slowly, settles beneath the skin, and sharpens every sense. One moved toward the nave, footsteps uneven, hesitant. Shadows bent toward him. The whispers followed, layered and insistent. Sins, sins, sins. The altar seemed to pulse, rhythmically, in tune with their rising heartbeat. Light from the candles flickered faster, responding or reacting to their presence. The team split briefly, moving to cover the perimeter. Each corridor, Each side chapel revealed the same patterns, shadows in impossible angles, whispers not tied to any speaker, faint marks in stone and wood that suggested hands, fingernails, desperation. A figure emerged at the far end of the nave, too quick, too fluid to be human, only an outline, a shifting mass of darkness. The investigators froze. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that pressed against their ears. The figure lingered just beyond the light. Their cameras caught nothing but a distortion, a ripple across space that seemed to breathe, and then it vanished. Panic rose, subtle at first. Rationality strained to reassert itself. They catalogued, documented, and recorded, yet the sense of intrusion, of being observed by something patient and intelligent, persisted. The sanctuary seemed alive, each shadow a sentinel, each whisper a reminder. Confessions not meant for mortal ears, pressed against the mind. Faith itself felt fragile here, bending under weight unseen. One investigator pressed a hand to his chest, shaking. It's not just shadows," he murmured. "It's listening, judging." The other nodded, though their face betrayed the same trembling comprehension. The figures' shapes of shadow, fragments of confession, lingering memories, seemed to converge subtly. The air thickened further, candle flames danced faster, creating patterns that disoriented. The walls themselves seemed to tilt, the stone breathing with faint rhythm, synchronous with their own rising anxiety. The investigators could not leave, could not stop observing. Curiosity, necessity, and the subtle pull of dread held them in place. And then one of them noticed the altar steps, faint scratches, deeper now. They were fresh, or perhaps newly revealed. They led toward the very center, the space beneath the crucifix. A cold wind swept through the sanctuary, not from any window, not from any draft. The shadows leapt and twisted, almost in response.
Whispers became clearer. "Your sins, confess. Your faith is thin." The lead investigator approached the altar, kneeling, hands trembling. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to step away from the crushing weight of unseen eyes. But he could not. Something pressed against him, something patient, pressing not on the body alone, but on belief itself, on understanding, on certainty. And then faintly, a shape appeared behind the crucifix, not solid, but distinct, not moving naturally, but in fragments, and the whispers turned to a single word: belong. The investigators stepped back, cameras rattled, their breaths came in shallow gasps. To the shadows remained, lingering, bending toward them in impossible angles. The sanctuary had shifted. They were no longer mere observers. The walls, the candles, the shadows themselves had begun to pull them into something deeper, something beyond comprehension. And in that moment, every conviction they held, every prayer, every certainty seemed to falter. The crucifix stared down, chipped, worn, eyes hollow, and in the hollow, the investigators glimpsed a weight pressing in, a presence beyond reason, a judgment waiting in silence. And that's when the first of them realized they had not come here merely to witness. They had entered something alive, something patient, something waiting in the shadows of the sanctuary. Light seeped through a cracked window, painting thin golden stripes across the dust-choked floor. The camera, or rather the mind's eye, lingered on a small alcove near the sacristy, tucked beneath a pile of decaying hymnals and faded vestments, lay a forgotten ledger. Its leather cover was cracked, brittle with age, the edges worn by countless hands that had touched it and abandoned it. The investigators approached cautiously, till every footfall echoed across the stone walls. The silence was thick, almost tactile, pressing against their ears, their chests, their thoughts. One of them knelt and lifted the book. The leather groaned softly, a sound almost like a sigh. Dust rose in thin clouds, swirling in the shafts of fading light. The first page was brittle, the edges crumbled under fingertips, but something wasn't right. Ink stained the pages in irregular patterns. Some lines were precise, almost reverent, others jagged, obsessive, annotations crowding margins, spilling into one another. The handwriting was elegant in places, frantic in others. Symbols were scattered, some resembling prayers, others more arcane, hints of something that defied easy comprehension. The investigators exchanged glances. Each line they read seemed to press on them differently. The words were devotions, yes, and yet, beneath the devotions lay something darker, an insistence, a ritualistic precision that suggested not worship, but something else. He opened another page. The words jumped out in a chaotic pattern: dates, names, hours of the night, descriptions of acts cloaked in the language of sanctity, fasts, vigils, confessions, and gestures repeated in exacting detail. But there were other entries, references to silences, to spaces untouched, to things unseen yet known. And that's when he heard it, the faint scratching from the far corner of the sacristy. Not nails on wood, not rats, but deliberate, measured, almost as if the room itself had begun to respond to the ledger's opening. They read on. Mentions of the congregation were sparse. The parishioners were distant, peripheral. The focus was entirely on one presence, one priest, his obsessions, his meticulous tracking of rites that had no acknowledgement in church records. Each annotation suggested a progression: devotion giving way to compulsion, compulsion giving way to obsession, obsession giving way to something that no light of faith could easily name. The investigators paused to take photographs, to document, to anchor themselves in rationality. But the ledger resisted clarity. The pages seemed to shift subtly beneath their fingers, as though the words themselves rearranged in faint, imperceptible ways. The line of prayer caught the eye. He listens when the church does not. He waits in silence. They froze. The words were not just written. They were meant to warn, to instruct, to draw attention. And something in the room agreed with them. The air thickened, carrying a faint metallic tang, sharp and pungent. Beneath the must of old paper and ink, the annotations became increasingly erratic. Notes about the confessional, about times when the shadows in the sanctuary aligned with particular prayers, about gestures performed in the absence of witnesses. One investigator flipped rapidly through the pages. The rhythm of the writing was almost musical, but off, an uneven cadence, like a hymn sung wrong, distorted, unsettling. That something wasn't right. The ledger's spine creaked as if straining under the weight of its own secrets. Tiny flecks of dark residue fell from the pages onto the investigator's hands. Not just ink, something else, something older. They realized the entries spanned decades, not years but decades. The same priest, or priests following a pattern, recording the same obsessive routines over generations. Or perhaps one mind, preserved through meticulous notation. The camera, or perception, lingered on the annotations, lines describing the confessional, not just as a place for confession, but as a conduit. The text hinted at observation, of monitoring, of pressing human will against divine boundaries. The investigators leaned closer, their breaths mingled with the faint smell of iron and ink. The words seemed to press into the mind as well as the eyes, subtle at first, then insistent. Thoughts of ritual, of acts committed in private, began to echo faintly in their own memories. And that's when he heard it again, soft, almost imperceptible, a voice, a sigh. The ledger seemed to hum, vibrate. In response, the shadows of the room lengthened, stretching across walls and ceiling. Candlelight flickered, as if disturbed by something unseen. A photograph fell to the floor. The flash briefly illuminated the sacristy. In that instant, the investigators swore they saw movement.
Shadows shifted independently of the light. Figures crouched, poised, waiting, not fully formed, but deliberate. Watching, they scanned the room, rationality straining against perception. There was nothing there, yet the pressure remained. Weight on their shoulders, in their chests, in the mind itself. The ledger offered no reprieve. Each page brought new compulsion, new insistence. Instructions for gestures, for alignment with time and shadow, for movements that defied ordinary ritual. One investigator whispered, he wasn't just writing prayers, he was building something. The others felt the same. A presence, not corporeal, but insistent, was pressing against the edges of perception. Something patient, waiting for the ledger to be read, waiting for acknowledgement. The annotations hinted at descent, not into heresy alone, but into obsession, into acts that were sanctified in the mind of the writer, but grotesque under scrutiny. Each page blurred the line between devotion and compulsion, between faith and darkness. The investigators realized they were no longer reading history. They were witnesses to a mind unraveling, to a ritual taking shape, centuries old, obscured by piety. Candles guttered, shadows pooled in corners. The sacristy felt smaller, tighter, oppressive. The words in the ledger seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. One investigator pressed a hand against his temple. Rationality wavered, faith wavered, understanding wavered. The ledger's final entries were erratic, incomplete sentences, observations of shadows that moved on their own. Notes about voices that whispered confessions in the absence of parishioners, mentions of waiting for the faithful to falter, and the investigators understood, with a sinking clarity, that this was no mere diary. It was a blueprint, a careful, obsessive blueprint for a descent into darkness, masked as devotion. The room seemed to lean closer. The candlelight dimmed. The shadows drew together, pressing at the edges of vision. The weight of centuries of observation, of unseen confessions, of ritual unacknowledged, pressed into the chest of every investigator. One of them whispered, trembling, "We shouldn't have opened it." The others could only nod. And then faintly, almost imperceptibly, the ledger moved, not by hands, not by draft. It shifted, subtle, deliberate. Pages fluttered, words realigned. And the presence, patient, unseen, pressing against faith itself, seemed to exhale. The investigators were no longer merely observers. They had crossed a threshold, and the priest's diary had begun to claim them. The air inside the church had changed. Night had fallen, and the sanctuary was no longer merely shadowed. It was alive with subtle movements. Candlelight trembled along the stone walls, stretching the shapes of pews and statues into impossible angles. Dust motes swirled like slow snow in the shafts of flickering light. The investigators approached the confessional. The booth stood silent, dark, as if waiting. The wood, scarred and worn, seemed to exhale a faint metallic scent, damp and iron. Old as the sins whispered within. They hesitated. Each step felt heavier than the last. The weight of the church pressed against them, not physically, but in the chest, in the thoughts, in the stomach. And yet, someone had to step forward. One investigator, a man in his 30s, moved closer. His hand brushed the carved panels. The wood was cold, yet almost pulsing beneath his fingers. A heartbeat too faint to measure, but too insistent to ignore. But something wasn't right. The first confession came softly, almost imperceptibly. A voice, low, intimate, not from the man, not from any of them, but speaking directly to him. "I harmed her," the voice whispered. The man froze. His heart stuttered. He knew he had never done such a thing. Yet the voice was persuasive, insistent. The syllables pressed against memory, reshaping, insinuating guilt. Other voices joined, faint, overlapping, echoes of sins that had never occurred, murmurs that scratched against the mind, bending reason, confessions of cruelty, of betrayal, of horrors he had never imagined committing. The investigators stepped back, their rational minds grasped at explanation. Hallucination, fatigue, echoes of the previous diary, the ledger, the shadowed sanctuary. But the effect was undeniable, and that's when he heard it. The scratching from within the booth. Not the wood, not the floor. Something softer, something deliberate, something waiting. One of them, a woman, knelt beside the confessional, listening. The whispers seemed to shift subtly. As her attention focused, the sin spoke directly to her. Tailored, intimate. A weight settled in her chest. Her fingers trembled. She shook her head. "I haven't done any of this," she whispered. The confessional ignored reason. Then the man stepped forward, compelled, drawn. The whispers wrapped around him, weaving a fragile web of guilt and fear. He paused at the threshold of the booth, glancing back at the others. His eyes were wide, expectant, terrified. "Go," the whispers coaxed. "Confess. Admit it." He entered. The door creaked closed behind him. Inside, the shadows deepened. Candlelight reached him faintly through the thin screen. The voices surged, pressing against thought, memory, conscience. Confessions not of his own creation spilled from unseen mouths. Words that described acts he could not imagine committing. Yet the truth of them pressed against his mind.
Outside, the investigators waited. Silence. Then a thump. The door shifted. A murmur, low, indecipherable, as if conversation were occurring inside the walls themselves. Minutes passed, and then the door opened. The man emerged, not the same. His eyes were wide, but blank, trembling, silent, hands shaking, fingers pale, knuckles white. He could not speak. Words died in his throat. His chest rose and fell rapidly, unevenly. The investigators reached for him. The whispers faded, only gradually. A pressure lingered in the room, pressing against reason, against faith, against memory. The confessional seemed to exhale, empty, still, waiting, patient, and yet the air was charged. The scent of iron, of damp wood, of something faintly acrid, clung to them. The team examined the booth. Nothing had changed. No footprints inside, no disturbance beyond the open door. And yet, the effect on the man was undeniable. He could not speak, he could not articulate what had occurred, only tremble, only blink at the walls, at the shadows, at the flickering candlelight. The whispers had retreated, for now, but the confessional had left its mark. Its reach extended beyond wood and paneling, into the mind, into conscience, into fear itself, and the investigators felt it. A shift, a change. The air was heavier, the shadows seemed to lean closer. One of them touched the wood of the booth, cold, yet almost alive under the fingers. The whispers returned faintly, teasing, tailoring themselves, waiting for the next confession. The trembling man was silent, and in that silence, the investigators realized that the confessional did not merely hold sins, it revealed them, invented them, pressed them into being, and no one, not even those who entered willingly, left unchanged. The shadows in the sanctuary seemed to pulse with quiet patience. The air grew thick, heavier still, pressing against faith itself, and the investigators understood. They had witnessed something alive, something that had learned to speak through them, and they were only beginning to understand its power. The camera drifted slowly through the empty nave, the lens catching dust motes in the last rays of evening light. Stone columns rose like silent sentinels, stretching toward a vaulted ceiling. The air was thick, almost tangible, heavy with incense long spent, and a faint, acrid tang of rust and damp wood. A man sat near the altar, shoulders hunched. His hands trembled in his lap, fingers entwined as if to hold himself together. The The investigators circled him quietly. He was the survivor, the silent witness, the one who had seen what others had not. He spoke slowly, hesitant, each word measured, weighted with memory. There was a priest, he began, voice barely above a whisper. He warned me, told me what the confessional holds, what it conceals. The investigators leaned in, careful not to disturb the fragile thread of his recollection. He vanished. The man continued. After he spoke, he disappeared. No trace, nothing. And that's when he heard it. A distant echo, the faint scraping of wood, the whisper of a hinge swinging on its own. The sound came from the confessional, still standing, patient and dark in the corner. The survivor's gaze drifted there, unseeing yet aware. I didn't believe it at first, he admitted. I thought, the confessional, it couldn't. His voice broke. The words refused themselves. He shifted, hands gripping his knees. Flashbacks came unbidden. The smell of burning wax, the faint rustle of papers, the creak of the confessional door closing, locking him inside. Or perhaps the priest, shadows twisting unnaturally in candlelight. He remembered the rituals, the prayers, repeated with an obsession that was almost surgical, movements precise, rehearsed, as if devotion had become machinery. The priest, once a figure of faith, had become something else entirely, methodical, relentless, and the confessional watched. He remembered the confession spoken, not aloud, not by the parishioners, but extracted, observed, recorded in silence. Each whispered admission twisted, altered, pressed into shapes of guilt that had no origin in truth. And that's when he heard it again. The low, insistent hum of judgment, not a sound, exactly, but a pressure against thought, against memory, against belief. The survivor shivered, recalling how he had first understood it. The confessional does not merely receive sin, it shapes it, distorts it, makes it live. The investigators pressed on gently. Why did the priest vanish? One asked. The man's eyes darkened. Because he tried to stop it. He tried to expose what was happening. And the church denied everything. They protect it at all costs. He paused, swallowed, and continued. I saw what happens when someone enters willingly, or when the confessional chooses them. Not every confession survives unchanged. Some are broken. The shadows around the confessional seemed to pulse in agreement. Candle flames flickered violently, then stilled. The air became heavier, almost viscous, pressing down on shoulders, on chest, on the mind. The survivor's memory returned to a night of whispers and scratching, when he had watched the priest kneel, tracing letters in the air, drawing shapes invisible to all but the confessional itself. The ritual was subtle, unobserved, but the intent was unmistakable. Control, observation, a claim on faith itself. And they all pretended not to see. He whispered, the church, they knew, they deny it, always deny it. So it continues. A gust of wind swept through the nave, not from a window, not from the door, just through the stones themselves. The survivor flinched. Candle flames bent away from the source. Shadows stretched in impossible directions. The investigators felt it too. The pressure, insistent, patient, the subtle tug, against understanding, against certainty. The survivor leaned back, closing his eyes. Images returned unbidden. The priest's voice low, urgent, warning him of the confessional's intent. The slow, deliberate way the confessional consumed those who entered. Not physically, not immediately, but the mind, the memory, the conscience. He opened his eyes, voice trembling. It chooses, and when it chooses,
There is no leaving unchanged. The investigators glanced at each other, rationality strained, but the fear was undeniable. The confessional was patient, waiting, observing, calculating. A candle guttered, shadows pulled into the corners, growing deeper, heavier, pressing against the walls as if the stones themselves leaned inward. The survivor's hands shook, the memory of the vanished priest pressed against him, the warnings, the absence, the knowledge that the church would not intervene. And that's when he heard it, the faintest scrape, coming from the booth. The sound was deliberate, measured, like nails on wood, or thought, pressing against matter. The survivor flinched, head jerking toward the confessional. His eyes widened. It listens, he whispered, and it remembers. Everything, every confession, every fear, every failure of faith. He shuddered, curling slightly inward. The investigators remained silent. The weight of history, of unacknowledged sin, pressed on the air. And they deny it, he said finally, because if they admit it, if anyone admits it, nothing survives. The shadows seemed to pulse in response. Candle flames danced. The room itself inhaled. Slow, deliberate, patient. The survivor's voice was barely audible. I survived, but I am not untouched. Not by what I saw, not by what I know. The investigators understood, quietly, as the air grew colder. Faith, reason, and certainty all felt fragile here, bending under the weight of observation, of denial, of something patient and unyielding. The confessional remained silent, and yet, everything in the room whispered its presence. The survivor's eyes darted to the booth again, trembling, silent, observing, and in that silence, the investigators realized they had not merely witnessed history, they had stepped into it, and the church, patient and indifferent, would deny them too. A single shaft of moonlight pierced the nave, tracing a narrow path along the cold stone floor. Dust swirled in the beam, slow and deliberate, as if stirred by unseen hands. The altar loomed ahead, its carved surfaces blackened by centuries, the wood faintly glistening, where candle wax had pooled and hardened over time. The investigators approached quietly. Every step echoed faintly, swallowed immediately by the cavernous silence of the church. The air was thick with the lingering smell of incense, old wood, and something metallic, faint but insistent. They had noticed the doors before, small locked panels tucked beneath the altar, nearly invisible, unless one knew where to look. Keys were missing, locks rusted, yet the sense of concealment was immediate and palpable. And yet, the church had allowed them to see. The lead investigator traced a hand along the cold stone, fingers brushing over the grooves of the lock. Symbols were etched around it, ancient, worn almost imperceptible in the dim light. Curved lines, geometric shapes, patterns that suggested both devotion and something else, something deliberate. But something wasn't right. The lock yielded unexpectedly, not by force, but by careful manipulation. A subtle shift, a faint click. The door creaked open, revealing darkness beyond. The investigators shone their lights into the small passage. The walls were close, damp, coated with centuries of soot and mildew. The air smelled heavier here, earthy, almost like turned soil. Each breath carried a subtle metallic tang that pressed against the back of the throat. The narrow corridor widened into a chamber beneath the altar. Stone walls curved into arches, rough-hewn yet deliberate. The floor was cold, uneven, slick with faint moisture. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending with the angle of the lights. And that's when he heard it. A faint scratching, not from stone, not from wood, something softer, deliberate, repetitive, like a warning. The chamber was filled with relics, objects that should have inspired reverence, but instead pressed on the mind with unease. Chalices tarnished with age, vessels carved with symbols that mirrored those on the doors above. Murals, faded and blistered, depicted scenes not of sanctity, but of acts that twisted devotion into something unholy. Figures kneeling, their heads bowed, faces obscured, hands raised in gestures that seemed both ritualistic and coercive. The investigators moved carefully. Every artifact seemed to insist on observation, to demand attention. Candles, long spent, had melted in forms that mimicked human shapes, frozen in hardened wax. And yet, the room did not feel abandoned. Shadows seemed to pulse along the walls. The air grew thicker, almost viscous, pressing lightly against the chest and throat. The investigators' fingers brushed over one of the murals. The paint was old, cracked, but the shapes pressed against memory, as though alive. Symbols coiled around human forms. Lines suggested rituals that were deliberate, systematic, repeated over generations. One of the investigators whispered, This isn't random. It's organized, planned, deliberate." The other nodded slowly. The realization settled in with a weight that pressed against reason. The evil was not isolated. It was systemic, ancient, still active.
A faint breeze swept the chamber, not from above, not from the entrance. The candle flames danced, despite the absence of flame. Shadows stretched, merging, bending. The murals seemed to shift slightly under the light. Gestures that were once indistinct became clear. Hands pointed, bowed, pressed against unseen thresholds. And that's when he heard it again. Soft footsteps, echoing faintly in the passage above, or perhaps in the chamber itself. The sound suggested movement, deliberate and patient, not human, not fully human. The investigators approached a relic tucked into a corner. It was a small altar, carved from dark wood, symbols etched along its edges. A vessel rested atop it, stained with something dark and sticky, faintly metallic. The symbols suggested an order, a sequence, a hierarchy, devotion given form and twisted into power. The air grew colder, shadows pooled in corners, stretching toward them. Candlelight, flickering faintly, revealed murals that seemed to gaze back, eyes painted but unmistakably alive under scrutiny. And then, a whisper, "Observe, understand, follow." The investigators froze, not a plea, not a warning, a command, deliberate, insistent. The chamber seemed to lean inward, pressing upon thought, upon reason, upon belief itself. A narrow staircase led deeper. They descended slowly, lights wavering, breath shallow. The walls closed in slightly, damp stone pressing subtly against the edges of perception. The relics grew more numerous, more deliberate. Objects of devotion, objects of secrecy, objects that carried a weight impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. And then the murals shifted, not physically, but perceptually. Gestures became clearer, faces turned toward them, expressions of expectation, not accusation, not anger, expectation. The investigators realized the scope. This was not the work of one priest, one generation, one mind. It was ongoing, continuous, institutional. The church above had denied it, concealed it, allowed it to fester through centuries, and the confessional was only the beginning. A relic at the far end drew the eye, a vessel, untouched by dust, smooth and cold. Symbols coiled around it, like a serpent. The investigators felt the subtle pull, the insistence of observation. They wanted to look away, but curiosity held them fast. The air pressed heavier, their breaths became shallower, rationality strained. The shadows deepened, The murals seemed to follow, eyes unblinking, gestures eternal, and that's when he realized it. The evil was not confined to wood, stone, or ink. It was systemic. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it was waiting. The chamber exhaled subtly, and the investigators understood there would be no turning back. The locked doors above were meaningless. They had opened a path into something that had always been present, and the church, ancient and patient, had seen them enter, and it would wait. Moonlight spilled across the nave, pooling in fractured lines along the worn stone floor. Dust rose slowly in its beam, drifting like spectral fingers across pews and statues. The air was still heavy, a silence that pressed against the ears and chest alike. The investigators moved cautiously, light sweeping over the altar, over the rows of chairs, over walls etched with centuries of shadow and neglect. Every surface seemed alive under the faint illumination, textures revealing themselves in ways that the rational mind strained to categorize. And yet, the church felt older than stone, older than wood, older than faith itself. But something wasn't right. The first manifestation came as a flicker, almost imperceptible. A figure, indistinct, appeared near the confessional, not solid, yet not entirely absent. It crouched, bent over, whispering, voices too faint to understand at first, then clear, insistent, accusatory. The investigators froze. The shadows seemed to swell in response to the figure, elongating along the walls and ceiling. Candlelight danced across surfaces in jerky rhythms, as though the flames themselves were frightened. The apparition shifted, and suddenly, the church was no longer merely itself. The past bled forward. The air thickened with the weight of centuries, of sins confessed and sins committed, of rituals repeated in quiet, obsessive devotion. Voices of the long-dead priests, hushed but commanding, echoed around them. Confessions not their own pressed into the investigators' minds, their content horrifyingly specific, intimate, and impossible. And that's when he heard it. A voice, low and deliberate, accusatory, recounting acts that had never occurred. Yet in its timbre, the investigators felt a weight of truth. Not truth as they understood it, but truth as the church had recorded it, as it had observed it, manipulated it, warped it. Figures appeared throughout the sanctuary, fleeting, insistent. Some knelt in quiet reverence, others writhed in subtle agony. They moved through pews, through walls, sometimes merging with shadows, sometimes emerging fully into light. Each carried a confession, a judgment, an echo of devotion twisted beyond recognition. The investigators were trapped, caught between chronology and memory, between observation and participation. The confessional from earlier now seemed omnipresent, its influence extending beyond wood and paneling. The room itself had become a recorder, a medium, replaying centuries of hidden sins in real time. And yet, the investigators were not observers alone. The apparitions acknowledged them. Eyes that should have been empty stared, assessing, weighing, probing. Gestures repeated, bows, kneeling, subtle motions of atonement. And the investigators' minds began to mirror them, almost involuntarily. A whisper of movement drew attention to the pulpit. There, a figure of a priest stood, hands clasped in prayer. The investigator nearest to him recognized the gesture from centuries-old annotations in the diary. The figure's lips moved, a confession, not of his sins but of the sins the church demanded to remember, sins that had been observed, recorded, replicated. The air grew denser. The boundaries of time collapsed further. The past was present, present was past. Each breath seemed to draw centuries of guilt into the lungs, each heartbeat synchronized with a rhythm older than any individual life in the building. The apparitions shifted again. One glided across the altar steps, hands tracing the edges of the stone,
The whisper of a bell echoed faintly, though the bell had long since fallen silent, and with it, the weight of judgment descended, subtle, insistent, inescapable. One investigator staggered backward, pressing a hand to his temple. Memories that were not his own pressed forward, acts committed under supervision, sins witnessed but never confessed, rituals performed in obedience to authority, distorted by obsession. He could not separate self from history, not fully. The other investigators tried to anchor him, to ground themselves, but the apparitions intensified, moving closer, gesturing, whispering. The shadows stretched and coiled, pooling along the floor and climbing the walls. Murmurs of confessions repeated themselves endlessly, layering over one another, a chorus of guilt and observation. And then, a single voice rose above the rest, clear, direct, personal. Admit it. No one spoke, no one could. The words pressed against memory, against conscience, against every measure of rationality they possessed. The voice did not ask, it demanded. The investigator nearest the confessional felt it as a physical weight in the chest, pressure that was not merely metaphorical, not merely emotional. The confessional had extended itself in time and space, into the room, into perception, into thought itself. They moved toward it cautiously, lights trembling, breaths shallow. Figures shifted to block their path, not obstructing, exactly, observing, testing, inviting, daring them to engage with centuries of confession, with acts and judgments beyond their capacity to rationalize. And then he heard it again, a scratching, low, deliberate enough to suggest intent. It came not from the floor, not from wood, but from the shadows themselves, curling along the edges of perception. The investigators tried to communicate, but words failed. Their own voices were swallowed by centuries of judgment replayed in living detail. Each echo was a moral labyrinth, every confession a corridor that led back to themselves, to their own fears, to their own untested faith. The shadows pressed closer, figures emerged fully, unblinking, silent, patient. They gestured, replaying rituals, gestures of atonement, acts of submission and fear. The investigators' own hands began to mimic them, unconsciously, as though the room demanded participation, demanded recognition. And then a sudden shift. The apparitions froze. The investigators froze. Time itself seemed to hinge on a single moment. The church exhaled, subtle but unmistakable, and in that instant, they understood. This was not history. This was judgment, living, breathing, patient judgment, older than the church above, older than the confessions, older than faith itself. The investigator nearest the pulpit collapsed to his knees. The shadows leaned in. The room seemed to close around them. Breath became difficult. The line between past and present was gone, and the confessional waited, silently, patiently. And the investigators realized they were trapped, not by locks or doors, not by walls or stone, but by time, by memory, by guilt, by judgment itself. And the echoes would not stop. A thin light cut through the blinds of a small office, dust motes floating lazily in its path. The investigators sat around a polished wooden table, notes spread in front of them, the weight of the church's secrets pressing in on every side. Outside, the city moved as usual, oblivious, unaware. They had expected resistance, but not like this. Calls went unanswered, letters returned unopened. Authorities were polite, then insistent. The matter was private, confidential, beyond discussion. Files were missing, records erased, and where some evidence had once existed, there was now only blank pages, typed letters claiming ignorance. But something wasn't right. Every denial was too perfect, every gesture of compliance too rehearsed. The church itself seemed to breathe, slow, deliberate, patient, a presence that extended beyond stone and wood, beyond human staff, into every letter, every form, every phone call. The investigators traveled from office to office, parish to parish, attempting to report their findings. Each attempt was met with subtle threats, legal language cloaked as guidance, polite reminders of confidentiality, warnings that their inquiries could complicate matters. They began to notice a pattern. Names of priests vanished from records. Meetings supposedly held were denied ever having occurred, and each parish they visited seemed to echo the last. Corridors and offices identical in their sterile, rehearsed hospitality. And that's when he heard it, a low murmur, almost imperceptible, coming from the woodwork of the offices. Not voices exactly, more like the ambient memory of voices, echoes of confessions, of apologies, of rituals observed but never acknowledged. The investigators froze, the hum pressed lightly against the skull, insistent, as if reminding them that the truth existed, but only in memory. Patient attempts to document findings were equally frustrated. Cameras failed, recorders cut out, emails disappeared mid-transmission, notes written by hand vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of indentation on paper. The church's influence, subtle yet undeniable, reached into technology, into bureaucracy, into perception itself. A legal representative arrived unannounced, tall, precise, impersonal.
He spoke with calm authority, reiterating the church's position. There is nothing to investigate. Records are complete. Any further inquiry may result in legal action. His words were measured, polite, deadly. The investigators felt the weight of that finality. It was not merely law, nor bureaucracy. It was institutional insistence, an assertion of control. The church had become a character of terror in its own right. They reviewed their notes again, trying to anchor themselves. Photographs of murals, confessional doors, relics, images of events that had shaken their understanding of faith were suddenly absent from memory. Some details seemed to recede, as if the act of observing had been noticed and quietly corrected by the institution itself. And yet, the memories persisted. The press of centuries-old confessions, the lingering pressure of the confessional, the sense that every step they had taken in the church had been observed, recorded, catalogued. They visited the offices of local authorities, hoping for intervention. To Bonite, records were altered, dates changed, names expunged, events erased as if they had never occurred. Questions were answered with rehearsed confusion, apologies for miscommunication, and always the subtle insistence that the church was beyond reproach, that something wasn't right. Every denial, every erasure, every act of feigned ignorance only confirmed what they had suspected. The institution protected more than it revealed. Centuries of secrecy, preserved not by oversight, but by design. Active, deliberate, patient. The investigators felt it pressing inward. Faith itself, questioned and bent, seemed to tremble under the weight of systemic denial. Each corridor, each office, each locked door seemed a warning. Do not look too deeply. They attempted one final report, compiling evidence, notes, photographs, interviews. The submission was returned unsigned, unread. A single line, stamped across the first page. No record of submission exists. And that was the final confirmation. The church had denied them, denied the history, the confessions, the evidence of corruption and ritual, denied reality itself. And in that denial, it had spoken, patient, calm, unyielding. The investigators left the offices in silence. Streets looked the same, people moved the same, oblivious, unaware, but they knew, and the knowledge carried a weight heavier than stone. The church's gaze, though unseen, followed through every report, every inquiry, every memory, patient, insistent, eternal. And the investigators understood finally that the terror was not hidden within walls or relics alone. It resided in the denial, in the control, in the careful, deliberate refusal to acknowledge what had occurred, and that denial would endure, and they would not leave unchanged. Moonlight spilled across the cracked pavement outside the parish. The investigators' footsteps echoed faintly in the empty streets, soft and hesitant, fading into the quiet of the night. The building loomed behind them, its silhouette sharp against the dim glow of street lamps, darkened windows staring like blind eyes. They walked in silence. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, incense lingering as though it refused to dissipate, clinging to memory. Their notes, cameras, and recordings felt heavy in their hands, artifacts of a reality that now seemed both urgent and impossibly fragile. But something wasn't right. The church seemed to exhale behind them, a subtle movement of air, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the skin crawl. The confessional doors, closed once more, appeared inert, but memory pressed against their senses, recalling the whispers, the scratches, the faint shifting of shadows within. Each investigator felt it differently. One caught the flicker of movement behind a stained glass panel, a shadow that did not belong to the branches outside. Another thought she heard soft murmurs, layered and indistinct, weaving around the words of prayers once spoken and once feared. And that's when he heard it, a low sibilant sound, almost beneath hearing, not coming from the church itself, but following. The cadence of it mirrored the confessional's rhythm, the measured inhale and exhale of judgment, observation, and patient memory. The road stretched empty before them. Street lights flickered, as if unsure of their task. The parish seemed to have receded, yet the air carried its presence like a living weight, pressing against thought and breath. They spoke quietly among themselves, tentative, each sentence measured. What had they witnessed? What had they experienced? Attempts to categorize events into reason and evidence failed. Reality, shaped by memory, felt thin, fragile, almost negotiable, and yet, the echoes persisted. The investigator carrying the priest's diary felt the weight of its pages differently now. Not just ink and paper, but something patient, lingering. Each annotation, each prayer, seemed to vibrate faintly, holding within it centuries of observation, secrecy, and deliberate concealment. Shadows along the parish walls seemed to stretch even in absence. The light caught on broken masonry, on chipped paint, on moss creeping along the foundation, reminding them that the building itself was a vessel, and vessels carry memory. The whispers grew, soft but insistent, not words exactly, but fragments, confessions, names, gestures, half-formed sentences repeating in the mind. They were not coherent, yet unmistakably present. A chorus of absence, pressing insistently against perception. One investigator paused, hand hovering over the closed confessional door. He remembered the survivor, the vanished priest, the ritualistic movements, the manipulation of faith itself. The thought pressed like a physical weight. The church had denied everything, but denial was only the surface. Beneath it, the machinery of secrecy remained intact, patient, eternal. They walked on, the streets curved, narrow, silent. The parish diminished in view, but expanded in memory. Each investigator felt the pull of what they had left behind, a gravity of conscience and fear that could not be shaken. And that's when she heard it, a faint murmur threading through the air, weaving into the rhythm of their footsteps. Not a sound meant to terrify, but to remind that what had been observed, what had been recorded in memory and confession, continued. That the confessional waited, that the doors, though closed, were not impenetrable to attention. The night carried them forward, yet every step was measured against what had been left behind. The investigators realized, in quiet unison, that leaving the parish had not severed its influence. It remained in thought, in memory, in the subtle tightening of the chest, in the way shadows shifted imperceptibly at the edge of vision. The city appeared ordinary, unaware, oblivious, and yet, the parish's presence lingered, insistent, patient,
It did not move, it did not speak aloud, but it pressed, lightly but relentlessly, against the mind. Each investigator felt a subtle fracture in belief, a hesitation where certainty had once been. They remembered the whispers of confession, the systematic concealment, the patient orchestration of denial. Memory and perception intertwined, creating a lattice of unease that could not be unraveled. The confessional doors were closed, the building receded behind them. The streets were empty, and yet something followed, soft, deliberate, patient, a reminder that darkness, though concealed, was not gone, that truth, though buried, was only superficial, that the church in its silence continued to watch, to record, to endure. The investigators slowed their pace, breaths came unevenly, hands shook faintly, memory pressed inward, past reason, past certainty, past comfort, and in that quiet, in the thin air of the night, they understood. The parish had not released them. It had merely begun a new form of presence, and they would carry it with them. Always, some confessions are never meant to be heard, but their echoes never die.